This time on Crime Inc. British drug couriers win a royal pardon. Mike Tyson in court again. London's summer of terror. The Drummond murders. Americans held hostage in Iran. And the Kennedy curse strikes again. But first, the Millennium Dome heist. The foiled Millennium Dome robbery of 2000 was a triumph of British policing. Perched on a strip of reclaimed dockland on the edge of the Thames River, the dome was built to showcase the best of Britain on the eve of the third millennium. On exhibit were 11 rare De Beers Millennium Diamonds and the flawless Millennium Star, together valued at more than £350 million. The jewels caught the eye of a gang of thieves who specialized in armed robbery. Unfortunately for the gang, they were already under secret police surveillance because the Met was monitoring some stolen vans being operated by the group. After some of the men were spotted casing the Millennium Dome, police realized they were after the jewels. Through superb detective work, investigators deduced when and where the robbers would strike. On November the 7th, 2000, a tactical team that included 60 armed flying squad members, 40 specialist firearms officers, and police dressed as cleaners patrolled the dome. Replicas replaced the diamonds just in case things went wrong. The thieves used a digger to smash through the perimeter fence and attempted to smash into a display case using sledgehammers and a nail gun. As soon as the men got close to the jewels, police moved in and arrested all 6 with a minimum of resistance. 2 years later, they were convicted and sentenced to jail terms of between 5 and 18 years. Despite the warnings, the lives ruined and the broken families, naive young Westerners continue to fall for the easy money promise of international drug smuggling. In 1990, it was Britain's Karen Smith and Patricia Carl, who was sentenced to 18 and 25 years in a Thai prison for attempting to smuggle heroin out of the country. 19-year-old Smith pleaded guilty, while 17-year-old Carl insisted she was innocent. 3 years later, Carl admitted her guilt, and the pair was pardoned by the King of Thailand after heavy pressure from British authorities. Carl and Smith were met by British embassy officials and escorted out of the notorious prison known, ironically, as the Bangkok Hilton, for its festering and overcrowded conditions. The case attracted worldwide attention because of the girls' young ages. Experts said it was likely they were set up by the drug syndicate to attract attention away from a larger heroin shipment being smuggled through customs at the same time.
Very emotional, lots of hugs and kisses and tears and tissues, and it was a wonderful moment for them. They're obviously delighted by all efforts, and they're particularly grateful to the King of Thailand.
But not everyone was happy with the British girls' release. Some critics back in England said the British government's role in the pardon sent the message that if its nationals broke the law overseas, the government would step in to rescue them. As the girls prepared to leave the country, 2 more British citizens were behind bars, charged with heroin trafficking. As a record-breaking boxer, Mike Tyson was known as Iron Mike, or the baddest man on the planet. Unfortunately, the heavyweight champion's boxing persona leached into real life, and he found himself in court in 2003 charged with assaulting 2 men in a Brooklyn hotel. In a brief appearance in Brooklyn Criminal Court, Tyson entered the plea of not guilty to 3 misdemeanor assault charges and charges of harassment and disorderly conduct. Tyson was charged with assaulting 2 men, Samuel Velez, 31, and Nestor Alvarez, 24, and a woman, in the early hours of June 21, outside the Marriott Hotel in downtown Brooklyn. Tyson faced up to a year in jail if the charges were proven. Defense attorney Mel Sachs told Brooklyn Criminal Court Judge Wayne Saita that the case should be dismissed because Tyson acted in self-defense. Both Velez and Alvarez were indicted on menacing and harassment charges from the same incident. The former heavyweight champion pleaded innocent to the assault, claiming that the two men he punched had taunted him first. His lawyers alleged that the two men told Tyson they were carrying guns. But prosecutors said his actions went beyond self-defense. It wasn't the first time Tyson had fallen foul of the law. He spent 3 years in prison for raping a former beauty queen. And the controversial boxer was also slammed for his aggression during a 1997 boxing match when he bit off part of his opponent's ear. In 1999, Tyson was sentenced to a year in prison, fined $5,000, and ordered to serve 2 years of probation and undertake 200 hours of community service for assaulting 2 motorists after a 1998 traffic accident. In 2002, a news conference to promote a bout between him and Lennox Lewis degenerated into a brawl as members of their entourages started throwing punches.
Even Mike Tyson is entitled to self-defense. These two men, about 5:30 in the morning, had been drinking. They bothered him, they provoked him, and they told him, "You have fists, we got guns," and they reached for a weapon in their waistband. And what Mike Tyson did was meet that force with force. He's entitled to act the way he did. Mike Tyson is innocent of any wrongdoing. He will not be found criminally responsible. Professional athletes like Mike Tyson are targets for individuals. They're targets of opportunity for people who are looking for a payday or people who want to show off to others. Mike Tyson did not do anything wrongful in any way. He was targeted.
The case was resolved in 2004 when Tyson pleaded guilty to disorderly conduct and was ordered to perform 100 hours of community service and undergo counseling. He told the court, "I was involved in a situation in which Mike Tyson's conduct was very disorderly." The plea bargain enabled him to avoid a jury trial that could have resulted in jail time. Coming up, Londoners targeted by Al-Qaeda. On July the 7th, 2005, London found itself directly in the line of fire in the War on Terror.
Suddenly, there was a massive explosion. Really big. People screamed, lights went out in all the carriages, it was filled with smoke, and everything just went deadly silent for a few seconds. People didn't know what the hell had happened. There was a pregnant woman on the tube.
Eventually everyone starts collecting themselves and trying to stay low and cover their faces. And we hear a woman screaming. I couldn't really tell which way it was from, but everyone sort of saying, calm down, you know, like sort of, you're not helping. But obviously, by the sounds of it, she must have been in a carriage full of bodies or something.
Suicide bombers targeted 3 trains on the Piccadilly and Circle lines, striking at the busiest time of the morning. With an unknown number of deaths and hundreds of injured, London's emergency services snapped into action and rushed survivors to hospital. Those who could and left on foot, traumatized and still in shock at their close call with death. But an hour later, it happened again. A red double-decker bus traveling from Marble Arch to Hackney had been diverted through Tavistock Square because of road closures around the tube stations. Suddenly, a huge blast ripped through the bus. One witness described a massive explosion that sent half a bus sailing through the air. 13 people, including the bomber, were killed. More than 100 were injured. At first, it was assumed that the religious extremists who carried out the acts were Al-Qaeda operatives from the Middle East. But soon Britons were confronted with the horrifying fact that the 4 young men who killed themselves and 52 others were born and raised in England. They were identified as Shahad Tanweer from Leeds, who killed 7 people on the Aldgate train. Hazib Hussain, who also lived in Leeds and killed 13 people in the Tavistock Square bus bombing. Ringleader Mohammed Sadiq Khan from Dewsbury, who died in the Edgware Road subway attack that killed 7. And an unknown man later identified as 19-year-old Jermaine Lindsay of Buckinghamshire, who caused the deaths of 25 people near King's Cross Station. The men's activities came as a terrible shock to Britain's Asian community, as the bombers came from unremarkable, non-militant families and had been schooled in secular government schools.
That's coming up every day.
But one by one, they'd secretly fallen under the spell of militant Islam, with Khan, Tanweer and Hussein known to have travelled to Pakistan.
We do know that he'd been to Pakistan. You say he'd been taking part in religious studies out there, and that was very recently, yes?
That's very recent.
That was the end of last year and the beginning of this year.
That's the end of last year, beginning of this year. That's the end of his life by look of it.
Did you see any change in him when you came back?
Nope.
Fear gripped London, with many people avoiding public transport after the bombings. 2 weeks later, it seemed this reaction was justified when 3 explosions rocked trains on the Underground and a bomb exploded on a double-decker bus. Fortunately, no one was injured, as detonator caps rather than the bombs themselves caused the explosions. A strange smell observed by witnesses raised fears of a chemical attack, but it was later confirmed that the smell came from the hydrogen peroxide used to create the devices.
People was panicking and that. It was like a very bad smell coming from the train, but I never seen no explosion myself, but I still thought everyone was going to die on it. People was told not to panic, but everyone was panicking.
London's transport system was brought to a standstill.
There's been an explosion, and that, in fact, that has happened somewhere between Ladbroke Grove and Hammersmith on the Hammersmith and City line.
The homemade bombs were quite amateurish, and eyewitnesses reported one suspect firing a handgun at a device to try and activate it. But police were unsure whether the attacks were related to the July 7 bombings and pursued thousands of leads in an attempt to discover those responsible.
Bombs appear to be smaller than on the last occasion, but we don't know the implications of all this yet.
With tensions high, police were under pressure to prevent any further attacks, which led to a tragic mistake. On the alert for a dark-featured man suspected of planting a bomb the previous day, police chased a man into a train at Stockwell Tube Station.
Yeah, I was sitting on the tube train. It hadn't pulled out of the station at this time, the doors were still open. I heard a lot of shouting, "Get down, get out." I looked to my right, I saw a chap run onto the train, Asian guy. He ran onto the train, he was running so fast he half sort of tripped, but he was being pursued by 3 guys. One had a black handgun in his hand, left hand, and as he sort of went down, 2 of them sort of dropped onto him to hold him down, and the other one fired. I heard 5 shots.
But instead of a suicide bomber, police had mistakenly killed Jean-Charles de Menezes, a Brazilian national who had no connection to the bombings. Scotland Yard released a statement acknowledging the error. For someone to lose their life in such circumstances is a tragedy, and one that the Metropolitan Police Service regrets.
This is a very disturbing aspect, particularly for Muslims, because they will now feel that if they are suspects, then the same thing might happen to them. And I believe it has a knock-on effect on getting them to cooperate with the security services.
The next day, an unexploded bomb was found near Wormwood Scrubs, and police descended on the area in full force to apprehend some suspects. The men they were after were West African-born Britons who had become followers of militant Islam and were suspected of training overseas with Al-Qaeda. Ramzi Mohammed, later convicted of the attempted bombing at Oval Tube Station, and Muqta Saeed Ibrahim, who was convicted of the attempted bombing of number 26 bus, barricaded themselves into their flat. Tearful residents waited for news of their families who were trapped by the police cordon. Shots were heard, although they were later found to be tear gas rounds fired by police. Police shouted to the men to give themselves up, and eventually they appeared on the balcony. Together with their accomplices, the men were found guilty of the attempted bombings and sentenced to 40 years jail. The court heard that the bombings had been planned for some time and were not a hastily arranged copycat operation. After the bombings, Londoners resumed their normal lives, but for many, the terror of July 2005 will never be forgotten. In August 1952, eminent British scientist Sir Jack Drummond and his wife and daughter were found brutally murdered in the sleepy town of Leur in southern France. 75-year-old farmer Gaston Dominici confessed to the murders and led police through the crime scene, explaining how he'd shot Sir Jack and Lady Drummond and clubbed their 10-year-old daughter to death with the rifle butt of a US Army-issue M1 carbine. Dominici later retracted his confession, but was convicted at trial and sentenced to death. However, 2 subsequent inquiries revealed inconsistencies in the police case, and his sentence was commuted to life. In 1959, President Charles de Gaulle released him on humanitarian grounds. Questions remain about how many murder weapons were actually used, motives for the murder, and whether Sir Jack was spying on a military chemical plant in the area. There are those who think Dominici was covering for a friend who had served in the resistance and was the true owner of the murder weapon. Coming up, the assassination of Robert Kennedy. When crowds of protesters stormed the American embassy in Tehran on November 4th, 1979, the United States was taken by surprise. 66 people were taken hostage to send a message to the US that Iran was no longer an American puppet state. Anger at the United States had been simmering since 1953, when American intelligence agents engineered a coup against the popularly elected Iranian Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh. The US had been concerned at the Prime Minister's plans to nationalize the oil industry and feared Iran was growing too close to the Soviet Union. The US delivered power to its ally, the Shah of Iran, receiving oil concessions in return. For nearly 30 years, the Shah enjoyed the spoils of office and became less and less tolerant of dissent, using the feared Savak secret police to intimidate opponents. But by 1979, the groundswell of dissatisfaction had become a tidal wave, and students, religious reformers, business people, and the intelligentsia united under the leadership of religious nationalist Ayatollah Khomeini. The Shah was toppled from power and fled to Egypt, but Iranians were furious when he was allowed to enter the United States for medical treatment. The decision was made to kidnap the American diplomats in retaliation. 13 women and African Americans were released early into the crisis, and a diplomat diagnosed with multiple sclerosis was sent home on humanitarian grounds. But the remaining 52 people stayed in custody for 444 days. During that time, President Jimmy Carter authorized a rescue mission codenamed Desert One. But the high-risk operation ended in disaster with the loss of 8 soldiers and the smoldering wrecks of 3 military helicopters. The bad press of the hostage situation directly contributed to Carter's election loss. Despite his best efforts, the hostages were not released until Ronald Reagan took office in 1981.
It was my decision to attempt the rescue operation. It was my decision to cancel it when problems developed in the placement of our rescue team for a future rescue operation. The responsibility is fully my own.
5 years later, officials in the Reagan administration were found to have illegally sold arms to Iran. It was later alleged that some of those involved in the arms negotiations had earlier been working covertly with the Iranians to stall the release of hostages, so Carter's presidency was undermined. However, the allegations have never been proven. The United States and Iran remain bitter enemies to this day. When John F. Kennedy became President of the United States in 1960, his younger brother Robert was an integral part of the administration. Having masterminded his brother's victory, Robert took on the heavy responsibility of Attorney General. But in 1963, tragedy struck when an assassin's bullets gunned down the president. In the dark days that followed, Robert was beside himself with grief, but he struggled to keep the administration running as power was transferred to the new president, Lyndon Johnson. Johnson and Kennedy did not get on well, so Kennedy transferred his political ambitions to the Senate, winning the seat from New York in 1964. But the senator saw this position as a stepping stone and was determined to enter the presidential race in 1968 to finish what his brother had started 8 years earlier. Robert Kennedy was under no illusions about the dangers of a Kennedy once again running for office. He had made many enemies during his stint as Attorney General, where he went in hard after organized crime figures and relentlessly pursued prosecutions. Robert was also outspoken in his support for civil rights, angering white supremacists, and developed a close relationship with Martin Luther King. Following King's assassination in April 1968, Robert's powerful and moving eulogy in Indianapolis, calling for reconciliation between blacks and whites, was credited with keeping at bay the unrest that swept many other cities in the wake of the civil rights leader's death. But like his brother before him, Robert's dream of a better world was to be brutally cut short. On the evening of June the 4th, 1968, Kennedy supporters had gathered in the embassy ballroom at Los Angeles Ambassador Hotel to await the result of the California primary for the Democratic presidential nomination. Robert watched the vote count on the television in his suite. It was a tight finish, but by 11:30 p.m. it became apparent that Kennedy had won. Robert and his wife Ethel came downstairs to greet supporters, and he gave what was to become his last speech. At 12:15 a.m., June the 5th, Kennedy left the podium and took a shortcut through a food preparation area on his way to meet the press. As he walked through the kitchen, acknowledging the cheers of the staff, a small man came towards him and fired a .22 caliber pistol, point blank, several times. The gunman, later identified as Palestinian immigrant Shiran Shiran, hit Kennedy and 5 bystanders with his 8 bullets and was taken into custody at the scene. Kennedy was rushed to hospital where he underwent several operations but died in the early hours of June the 6th. He was only 42 years old. With Martin Luther King's untimely death still fresh in their minds, Americans were devastated by the news of this new political murder. They looked for someone to blame, and a 24-year-old mentally disturbed man seemed too small a target. A Gallup poll taken at the time showed a majority of Americans believed the assassination was a political conspiracy cooked up by Kennedy's enemies. There was no love lost between the presidential candidate and organizations such as the FBI, whose Deputy Chief Clyde Tolson was reported to have said of Kennedy, "I hope that someone shoots and kills the son of a bitch." Shiran himself was inconsistent in his recollection of events, and his incoherent ramblings were used by his defense to suggest he'd been put in an hypnotic trance and programmed to carry out the murder. With so many witnesses, it was impossible for the defense to argue that their client had not pulled the trigger. A diary discovered in Shiran's home included the entry, "My determination to eliminate RFK is becoming more and more of an unshakable obsession. RFK must die. RFK must be killed. Robert F. Kennedy must be assassinated." Psychologists concluded that Shiran had been angered by Kennedy's support for Israel and decided his death would benefit the Palestinian cause. Shiran's defense team wanted to accept a plea bargain with the prosecution, where he would plead guilty in return for life in prison, rather than the gas chamber. But the judge ruled that he had to stand trial in the interests of dispelling the conspiracy theories that were gaining force. After a 15-week trial, Shiran was found guilty and sentenced to death. But the abolition of the death penalty in 1972 saw his sentence commuted to life. He remains in California's Cochran Prison, where his application for parole has been refused several times. Kennedy was buried in Arlington National Cemetery near his brother John. Since his assassination, Secret Service agents have been assigned to protect presidential candidates. Robert and John's brother Edward went on to serve out a distinguished career in the United States Senate.